The 1992 Disney film opens with a reference to the Newsboys' strike of 1899. The first image that appears after the Walt Disney Castle is a black screen with the words in white, "This story is based on actual events." And this is followed by a voiceover describing these events. In this voiceover, the narration states, quote, "In 1899, the streets of New York City echoed with the voice of the Newsies. Peddling the newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, and other giants of the newspaper world, on every corner you saw them carrying the banner, bringing you the news for a penny a pape. Poor orphans and runaways, the Newsies were a ragged army without a leader, until one day all that changed," end quote. This leader, as we have discussed in the character breakdown lecture, is Jack Kelly. Until the end of this narration, Disney did a valid job summarizing the way life was for the Newsies. It's enough to hook viewers, and it's only mildly offensive to the truth of the Newsboys' strike of 1899. In the first official opening scene, the boys are seen waking and dressing for the day in the lodging house, as pictured here. The Newsboys' lodging house was in fact real, according to David Nassau. Places such as these were available as dormitories for not just street waifs or runaways, but for children laborers with homes as well. Once it's time to purchase their papes, the Newsies go to the press. As we already know, the Newsies purchased some papers, but others were loaded into delivery wagons for another way of distribution. Disney's film portrays the Newsies coming off the press and another child laborer slamming his hand atop a stack of papers and yelling, "These are for the Newsies." The Newsies, all boys in this depiction, line up at the barred window in order to pay and receive their papers. This setting is also completely accurate. I've placed two images here side by side, one in black and white from the early 1900s after the strike, and the other in color is obviously from the Disney film. As you can see, the setup is similar, if not identical. After the new Newsies, David and Les, join the newspaper selling game, the boys go out on the rare privilege of selling papes with Jack. A boxing match takes place in the middle of the street, so Jack shoves, pushes, and elbows his way through, yelling out false headlines. This too is an accurate representation of Newsies' activities. When David questions this tactic of selling papers, basically calling it dishonest, Jack tells him, quote, "Headlines don't sell papes, Newsies sell papes," end quote. The day takes an unexpected turn, however, when Jack and his new friends must run from Snyder, the overseer of the refuge, a rehabilitation center we will discuss a little later. I'd rather focus now on the boys who run to the theater as a sanctuary. As mentioned while discussing the character of Meta Larkson, this practice of Newsies seeking a place to sleep in the theater was not uncommon. Disney isn't completely accurate in this depiction, but it still correlates to the idea of Newsies searching for a place to seek a better refuge than the refuge we'll talk about later. After leaving David and Les's home and meeting their family, which included not only both parents, but a sister as well, Jack goes out onto the streets, denying the invitation to sleep there, and expresses his dream to leave New York for Santa Fe, where he believes he belongs and would be welcome. At dinner, he told the Jacobs that his parents were in Santa Fe looking for work and a place to live. But this isn't the case. He's alone, as was a reality for some Newsies. This scene is immensely significant because it suggests the difference between Pulitzer's American Dream and Jack Kelly's American Dream. Remember, this scene takes place before the strike even happens. It's important to note that Jack Kelly is just getting by at this point, but deep down he dreams for more. But even so, this more he hopes for isn't fame and glory and money. Not really. It's simplicity and ease in the conditions of his life. The following day, the Newsies are informed that the price has increased from 50 cents to 60 cents per 100 papers, and they become immediately enraged. This may be the largest inaccuracy in the film that could be led to a drastic public misconception regarding American history as it relates to the 1899 strike. As we talked about in Lecture 1, the price raise didn't happen overnight. It happened 1 year prior. Disney, for the sake of a plotline, makes the price raise appear like it occurred because the circulation was decreasing, but that's not the case. Yes, circulation fell after the war, but the Newsies decided to strike because circulation was low. The price was still 10 cents higher than it had been prior to, that's why they wanted to, because it was 10 cents higher still, and they weren't getting as many sales. So it was their decision to strike because of low circulation, not Pulitzer's decision to raise prices because of low circulation. The decision to strike and to form the Newsboys Union, however, takes place at this point, and this action of meeting as a group and deciding to strike plays on the communication tactics that were utilized in 1899 by the striking newsboys. The boys even go so far as to discuss in the film how to spread the news to other districts that they've decided to strike and are looking for Newsies to support them in boycotting the World and the Journal. A reporter from The Sun, Brian Denton, witnesses these events and questions David, even going so far as to make the pun about David and Goliath that was abundantly common in the original strike press from other newspapers. Denton treats the boys to a meal, interviewing them about their plan of action moving forward in the strike. Boots, Davy, and Jack then go to Brooklyn to visit Spot Conlon. They are shown crossing the Brooklyn Bridge up close, and then the picture spans out, giving the viewer a full picture of the bridge connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan. This image appeals to the changes within the city as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Spot Conlon, once they get there, tells the Newsies that he'll join the strike when the Newsies show that they won't back down at the first sign of trouble. It's almost amusing how similar this is to France's involvement in the American Revolution for independence against Great Britain. Hesitant at first, but making victory entirely possible later after the Continental Army had proved themselves capable of winning. Disney knew who their audience was. Americans who it seems are inherently inscribed with a love for a revolutionary story. The Newsies begin now to practice their activism through the same violent acts that occurred in 1899. The scabs are soaked for attempting to sell papes. The Newsies tip over wagons at the press window and go about tearing newspapers to shreds and throwing pieces all over the streets. Almost all the Newsies escape unscathed when the cops arrived, all except Crutchy, who is slow to get away and is literally dragged to the refuge. Now is the time to discuss the refuge. Jack defines the refuge as the place where the orphans are taken after arrest. He tells David, quote, "An orphan gets arrested, Snyder makes sure he gets sent straight here so he can rehabilitate him, you know. The more kids in the refuge, the more money the city sends to take care of them, the more Snyder sticks in his pocket." In Bartoletti's book, she states that child laborers who were arrested were sent to jail while they being the cops, attempted to find the child's parents. This would apply for runaways too, because even if they ran away, they had parents somewhere. Bartoletti makes no distinction about what would happen for orphans, most likely because this wasn't a common reality. As discussed in Lecture 1, most of the Newsies had parents and went home to places like lodging houses. There were only some who were street waifs, as Disney abundantly depicts. Upon meeting at the gates of the press to enter in for paper distribution, the Newsies met not scabs, but adult men who intended to soak the boycotting Newsies. This strategy of sending men out in the streets to sell papers was utilized by Pulitzer during the strike of 1899. About 700 men, according to an article in the New York Times, were hired to sell papers for $2 a day. The idea behind this was that the boys would not be brave enough or successful in beating adults for their cause. This tactic was unsuccessful on the part of Pulitzer. The Newsies had no problem taking down any scab as long as they were male. And why wouldn't they? The world, referring to the nation at large and Pulitzer's paper, saw these boys as laborers just as much as they saw adults as laborers. So why would a newsie see an adult getting paid $2 to sell newspapers as anything else but enraging and would make him want to punch said adults? It wasn't a deterrent. It didn't instill fear in the newsboys. Instead, it enraged them. However, this isn't what Disney depicts. What Disney shows is actually quite gruesome and shocking considering how tame Disney films are notoriously known to be. These men, if not hired, they're at least encouraged by Pulitzer to stop the striking newsies through brute force. They are not police or any type of law enforcement. Adults wrapping chains around their fists and carrying large sticks proceed to soak the newsies, literal children. Luckily for the Manhattan Newsies, Spot Conlon and his gang of newsies arrive, as promised, to save the day. It is also symbolically pleasing that Conlon's weapon of choice is a slingshot and marbles. This form of weaponry only further aids to the story of David and Goliath. While Disney took some liberties in expressing the violence between Newsies and Pulitzer's henchmen, the Newsies are still surprisingly victorious in defeating the adults just as they were in 1899. It is also significant that police are absent in these acts of boycotts and violence. The same New York Times article that reported of Pulitzer's 700 hired men also reported that, quote, although policemen were sent to many of the stations to guard the new vendors, they did not make many arrests. The boys were sudden in their attacks and quick in dodging the bluecoats, who, in some cases, did not seem anxious to catch the culprits, end quote. It isn't until the rally at Irving Hall that the cops in the film become involved in making arrests. And this actually only happens because Crutchy recognizes Jack's image in the sun that is paired with Denton's article and slips up around Snyder while he's in the refuge. Snyder approaches Pulitzer about Jack Kelly, the escaped criminal from the refuge. During the day, Jack meets with David and Les's sister, Sarah, whom he seems to be smitten with. He expresses his dream of leaving for Santa Fe, and she tells him that the sun out there is the same one here in New York. With this dream still on his mind, along with thoughts of Sarah, Jack joins the newsies from all over the city that have gathered at New Irving Hall that night in order to discuss the next steps in the strike. As it turns out, Irving Hall is the same theater where Meta performs in that the boys run into to avoid Snyder earlier in the film. While this is potentially inaccurate, the scene outside and inside Irving Hall on the night of the rally is properly representative of July 24th, 1899. I just now realized that's very similar to July 4th. There may be something to that. Probably not. Moving on. Newsies are outside the theater and crammed inside the hall in order to listen to the speakers. David and Jack tried to convince the newsies to stop soaking scabs as much as with as much, power and rhetoric as the newsies in 1899 advised on that same night. Spot Conlon, however, disagrees. The newsies kind of get up and they start yelling at each other, and he can see that they're breaking apart. And so Jack tells them that they must stick together or we're nothing. Sound familiar? Sort of maybe like Kid Blink? So in the end, Spot Conlon agrees to stop the violence, and the newsies rejoice. The meeting is somewhat ended with a song sung by Miss Meta. This is also somewhat familiar, considering a song was sang by a newsie at the end of the Irving Hall rally. I'd like to take a moment now to point out that arguments that simply suggest that this film is inaccurate because the Newsies weren't singing and dancing while fighting for pennies to live in 1899. In this way, they kind of were. The new Irving Hall meeting ended with a patriotic song, and in another lecture we'll discuss the music and how some of these songs are implicitly American and patriotic. Nevertheless, the completion of Miss Meta's song does not end with the Newsies going on about their way, filled with glory and hope for the future, ready to strike without violence. Instead, Irving Hall is invaded by Snyder and police. The Newsies scramble, but are ultimately attacked and beaten as Meta screams that they are only children. Numerous Newsies are arrested, including Spot Conlon, Kid Blink, Boots, Racetrack Higgins, and Jack. They are all charged either $5 or 2 weeks confinement in the House of the Refuge. All that is except Jack. Denton pays for the Newsies' fines. This luxury, I'm sure, was not granted to anybody in 1899. And they go on their way. Denton, Davy, and Les stand by, though, while Snyder reveals the truth about Jack's identity in front of the judge in the courthouse. Jack Kelly's real name is Francis Sullivan. His mother is deceased and his father is a convict. He escaped the House of Refuge after a series of disruptive behavior and escapes. Jack is ordered to be incarcerated at the refuge until the age of 21. Disney's The Sun refused to print any articles on the attack at the rally due to Pulitzer's ban on printing strike materials. This ban is inaccurate. It never happened. As we know, the newspapers like The Sun took pleasure in reporting on Pulitzer's failures. Nevertheless, as Disney depicts, Denton leaves town after giving Davy the article he wrote that went unpublished covering the rally. Jack is taken to see Pulitzer, who makes him an offer. Pulitzer says Jack can stay locked up in the refuge, or he can be released with money in his pockets. That alone wasn't enough for Jack. Pulitzer says that if Jack works for him until the strike is over, he can have money and a ticket to wherever he wants. Jack still kind of is making jokes, being a smartass. So then Pulitzer threatens David and his family, along with every other newsie. Upon leaving Pulitzer's office, Jack makes a run for it, but then reconsiders out of worry for David and his family. When Jack is presented the following day as a scab, the newsies don't see Jack's concern for their well-being, mainly because he puts on a tough guy persona, claiming that he has to look out for himself. They only see him as a scab, a traitor. What is particularly ironic about this scene is, while Jack is dressed in a suit and tie, carrying a huge stack of the world's newspapers, it is Kid Blink, of all people, who cries out, "Jack, Jack, what are you doing?" over and over. While it's ironic and humorous if you're in on the fact that the real Kid Blink turned out to be a traitor, it further muddles the perception of the viewer who lacks this historical awareness, thus mythologizing Jack Kelly, a purely fictional person anyways, over, looking at the real historical fact of Kid Blink and his traitorous actions. For the remainder of the strike, Jack is allowed to sleep in the basement of the press headquarters atop an old abandoned printing press. On Jack's second day of working as a scab, the Delancey brothers, who I've avoided mentioning due to their basic irrelevance in the plotline, take to the streets in hopes to bait Jack into acting out. So he has to go back to the refuge, but also to try and put an end to the strike. You see, the Delancey brothers are child laborers too, teenagers just like most of the other Newsies. Except, instead of buying and distributing papers, they basically do the work of counting out the papers for the Newsies at the press window, where the Newsies line up to make their purchases. At this point in the film, the Delancey brothers demonstrate the same naked and unregulated violence and abuse that the grown men did at the press headquarters before arresting Crutchy, and again at the Irving Hall rally. Les, the youngest Newsie, is shoved into a wall onto piles of junk in an alley after trying to defend Sarah. The Delancey brothers grab Sarah by the shoulders and forcefully guide her backward into an alley away from the sight of passerbys on the street. This behavior, insinuative of sexual assault, is alarming to see featured in a Disney film, especially since there's no historic grounds for including it. Sarah punches the brother who grabbed hold of her, but his smirk that he gives her from his bleeding lip is skin-crawling. And in its portrayal, it kind of seems, at least from my viewing, that her action didn't really deter him, but instead fueled his intentions. It's very strange to see this in a Disney film. Luckily, it doesn't really go further than this. Davy shows up in that moment. Sarah yells for him to run away. But instead he comes for his sister, obviously. And he's beaten by the Delancey brothers, one of which, the one with the bleeding lip, places brass knuckles on his hand and is prepping for his big moment to hit Dave once his brother is finished. Luckily for David, this doesn't happen because Jack shows up and breaks his promised scab behavior in order to defend David, Les, and Sarah. Prior to this violent stream of events, Sarah had found the article Denton wrote on the rally and shared it with David and Jack. They go to Denton's apartment home, where they decide to print their own paper and reveal how the city thrives on child labor and how this is indeed exploitive. The Newsies will circulate this paper, which will be printed on the press that Jack slept on while a scab, basically meaning he's going to print a newspaper against Pulitzer with Pulitzer's old, unused printing press he no longer cares about, just like he no longer cares about the Newsies. This paper is titled the Newsies Banner, and it is distributed by the Newsies to any and all child laborers in sweatshops or working on the streets that can read. This act of printing their own papers is historically accurate. A New York Times article reported that when the Newsies threw the boycotted papers out onto the street, quote, many citizens began picking up the papers and started to read them, but the leaders of the boys would not allow that and snatched the papers from them, tore them up, and threw them into the roadway, shouting, "No true friend of organized labor will read them papers. We's got other union papers, pay a penny and read them." End quote. Therefore, the Newsies did have their own papers, but they weren't freely distributed, as the film portrays. As a result of the Newsies banner in the film, thousands of child laborers parade through New York in strike of Pulitzer and Hearst, demanding their rights as children be recognized. Jack reconfronts Pulitzer. He bombards Pulitzer with the voices of thousands of child laborers. Don Seitz tells Pulitzer that the boys put out a pretty good paper, which is along the lines of Seitz's own surprise at the success of the Newsies in 1899, as documented in his memos that were sent to Pulitzer. Without a clear indication as to how the strike is really settled in the film, it is. Disney gives no indication as to whether the price went down, whether Pulitzer agreed to buy back unsold papes, or both. The strike is just simply over. But there's that pesky issue of the refuge still. The refuge wagon pulls up, releasing all the children, including our beloved Crutchy. Snyder is then arrested by officers for his criminal behavior. In addition, in complete irrelevance to the Newsboys' strike of 1899, Governor Teddy Roosevelt arrives, thanks to Denton. And it was Roosevelt's actions that had the children of the refuge released and Snyder arrested. Due to Jack's legacy of escaping the refuge, once upon a time on the back of Roosevelt's carriage, he is allowed to sit up front right beside Roosevelt, who agrees to drive him anywhere, even the train station. Jack has finally his opportunity to go to Santa Fe. But it wouldn't be a Disney film if Jack left the girl and all of his friends behind. So he's driven around town and then dropped outside of the gates of the world, ready to sell some papes. Happily ever after and all. Overall, as expected, Disney takes some liberties in executing this story. Some characters are ambiguously based off real Newsies. There's general consensus built up in the film that most Newsies are orphans, which is inaccurate, and some events are embellished for dramatic entertainment and to simply scare anyone old enough to understand what's happening. However, the essence of the film, or of the 1899 strike, is captured, and the film really does do a good job in a lot of spaces and places in the film of representing historical truth. The film presents two opposing American dreams, however, that is essentially important. One of the greedy Pulitzer, who is in a constant quest for more, a big life in a big city, versus the Newsies' dream of just enough for comfortability, for a sense of belonging and basic rights. While not all of the problems are solved from the strike then, or really in the strike as Disney portrays it, the Newsies were heard and they were given tools to continue achieving their dream. In the same way, Disney's depiction captured that. Not only were the Newsies able to go about selling papers again with a sense of victory and having their voices have been heard, Jack was able to get the real dream that he always wanted. It was never really Santa Fe. We all know it was always a family.